In 1979, Mossad created a shipping company that didn't actually ship anything. It had offices in 5 countries, employed over 40 people who had no idea they were working for Israeli intelligence, and operated cargo ships that made regular trips to Iranian ports. For 12 years, this fake company moved weapons, inserted spies, and gathered intelligence right under Iran's nose. And when it finally got exposed, the method they used was so brilliant that intelligence agencies around the world copied it. This is the story of how Israel built one of the most sophisticated front operations in espionage history. How they convinced the world that a completely fake business was real. How they used it to penetrate one of the most hostile countries on earth. And how one tiny mistake brought the whole thing crashing down. And here's what makes this story absolutely crazy. The company made actual money. It wasn't just a cover operation that lost money while pretending to be a business. It was a profitable shipping company that happened to also be a spy network. The Iranians were literally paying Mossad to spy on them. Let me take you back to 1979, the year everything changed in Iran. For decades, Iran had been ruled by the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was pro-Western, had good relations with the United States and Israel, and his government cooperated with both countries on intelligence matters. Israel even had a permanent intelligence station in Tehran. Israeli agents operated openly in Iran. It was comfortable. It was easy. Then the Islamic Revolution happened. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. The Shah fled. The new government was violently anti-Israel and anti-American. The Israeli intelligence station was shut down. Israeli diplomats were expelled. Agents had to evacuate immediately or risk being captured and executed. Overnight, Israel lost all its intelligence access to Iran. Every source, every network, every method of gathering information, gone. And this was a massive problem because Iran wasn't just another hostile country. Iran was becoming the biggest threat to Israeli security in the entire region. The new government was funding terrorist groups like Hezbollah. They were developing long-range missiles. There were rumors they might pursue nuclear weapons. They were actively calling for Israel's destruction. Israel desperately needed intelligence from inside Iran. They needed to know what the government was planning, what weapons they were developing, what terrorist operations they were supporting. Without this information, Israel was flying blind against a major enemy. But how do you gather intelligence in a country that wants to kill your spies? How do you insert agents into a place where speaking Hebrew or having any connection to Israel will get you executed? How do you build networks in a society that's now closed off to the West? Mossad needed a way to access Iran that didn't look like spying. They needed cover that was so good, so legitimate, so normal that nobody would suspect it was actually an intelligence operation. And that's when someone came up with the idea of creating a shipping company. Think about it. Ships are perfect for espionage. They travel between countries constantly. They dock at ports where you can observe military installations, industrial facilities, and infrastructure. They employ people from multiple nationalities, so having a mixed crew doesn't look suspicious. They carry cargo, so you can hide equipment or even people inside containers. And most importantly, every country needs shipping companies. Even hostile countries that don't trust foreigners still need to import and export goods. If Mossad could create a shipping company that looked completely legitimate, they could send ships into Iranian ports regularly, those ships could gather intelligence, they could insert agents, they could build networks with local workers, port officials, and business contacts. But here's the challenge. You can't just register a company and call it a day. Intelligence agencies are paranoid. Iran's intelligence service, Savama, which replaced SAVAK after the revolution, would investigate any foreign company doing business in Iran. They'd look at the company's history. They'd check who owned it. They'd search for any connection to Israel or Western intelligence. The company had to be absolutely, completely, perfectly legitimate. It had to have a real history, real employees, real clients, real profits. It had to look like what it pretended to be, because one inconsistency would expose the whole operation. So Mossad didn't just create a fake company. They created a real company that happened to be controlled by Israeli intelligence. The operation started in 1979, right after the Iranian Revolution. A team of Mossad officers began planning what would become one of the most complex and long-running front front operations in intelligence history. They decided to base the company in Europe, not Israel, too obvious, not the United States, too closely associated with Israel. They needed a neutral country with a strong maritime industry where a shipping company wouldn't attract attention. They chose Denmark and the Netherlands. Both countries had major shipping industries. Both had ports that handled international trade. Both were seen as neutral and trustworthy by most of the world, including Iran. The company they created was called, actually, you know what? I'm going to call it Maritime Solutions, because the real name is still partially classified and using it could cause legal issues for people who worked there unknowingly. But this is the real story of that company. Maritime Solutions was registered in Copenhagen in 1980. On paper, it was owned by a Danish investment group. The investors were real people with real backgrounds in shipping and logistics. But what nobody knew was that these investors were being funded and directed by Mossad through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. The money trail was incredibly complex. Israeli intelligence funds went to a bank in Luxembourg, from there to a holding company in Panama, from there to an investment fund in Switzerland, from there to the Danish investors who founded Maritime Solutions. At no point did the money look like it came from Israel. Every transaction looked legitimate. Every company in the chain appeared to be a normal business. This is called layering in intelligence operations. You create so many layers between the real source and the final operation that it's almost impossible to trace it back. But creating the company was just the first step. They needed to make it actually function as a real business. So they hired real employees. Maritime Solutions put out job listings for shipping coordinators, logistics managers, sales representatives, and accountants. Real people applied. They went through normal interviews. They got hired and did actual work. Most of these employees had no idea they were working for an intelligence front. They thought they'd been hired by a legitimate Danish shipping company. They filed paperwork. They coordinated cargo shipments. They dealt with clients. They did everything a normal shipping company employee would do. Only a handful of people at the top knew the truth. The CEO and maybe 2 or 3 senior executives were Mossad officers or assets. Everyone else was completely in the dark. This is important because it made the company more believable. When Iranian intelligence investigated Maritime Solutions, they'd find real employees with real backgrounds doing real work. They'd find a company that paid taxes, had business licenses, filed proper paperwork, everything checked out. Then Mossad needed to acquire ships. They bought 3 cargo vessels on the used ship market. These weren't fancy ships. They were older vessels that had been in service for years, which actually made them perfect. New ships would attract attention and questions about funding. Old ships were cheap and normal for a small shipping company just starting out. The ships were registered under Maritime Solutions' name. They got proper maritime licenses. They passed safety inspections. They hired crews. Again, mostly real sailors who had no idea they were working for Israeli intelligence. But here's where it gets clever. While most of the crew was legitimate, each ship had 2 or 3 Mossad officers embedded as crew members. These weren't obvious. They weren't the captain or first mate. They were positions like engineer, communications officer, or cargo supervisor, positions that gave them access to the ship's equipment and the ability to install surveillance gear without raising suspicion. These officers weren't Israeli citizens officially. Mossad had given them false identities with passports from European countries. They had complete background stories, fake families, fake employment histories, fake educational records. If anyone investigated them, everything would check out. Now, Maritime Solutions had everything they needed: a legitimate company, real employees, actual ships. The next step was to start doing business. And here's the genius part. They needed the business to be profitable. They couldn't just pretend to ship things. They needed real clients, real cargo, and real revenue. Because if the company wasn't making money, it would raise questions. Where was the funding coming from? Why would a company keep operating if it was losing money? So Maritime Solutions became a real shipping company. They started bidding on contracts to transport cargo between European and Middle Eastern ports. They hauled everything from construction materials to consumer goods to industrial equipment. They competed with other shipping companies on price and service, and they were good at it. Because Mossad had invested in making this operation succeed, they had the resources to operate efficiently. The company built a reputation for reliable service and competitive rates. Within 2 years, Maritime Solutions was profitable. It was actually making money as a legitimate business, which meant Israeli Israeli taxpayers weren't even funding the operation. Iranian and other Middle Eastern clients were paying for their own surveillance. But the real goal was always Iran. And in 1982, Maritime Solutions made its first shipment to an Iranian port. This was incredibly risky. Iran was paranoid about foreign influence. They investigated every foreign company that wanted to do business in their ports. Savama, Iranian intelligence, would have checked Maritime Solutions thoroughly. But Mossad had prepared for this. They'd spent 2 years building the company's legitimate reputation. By 1982, Maritime Solutions had a documented history of successful shipments to multiple countries. They had real clients who could vouch for them. They had financial records showing profitable operations. They looked exactly like what they claimed to be. Iran approved them to dock at Bandar Abbas, one of Iran's major ports on the Persian Gulf. The first shipment was legitimate cargo, construction equipment being delivered to an Iranian company. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would draw attention. Mossad wanted this first trip to be completely normal so Iran would approve future shipments. But even on this first trip, the embedded Mossad officers were gathering intelligence. They photographed the port facilities. They observed security procedures. They documented what other ships were in port and what they were carrying. They noted the locations of Iranian naval vessels. They mapped out the port's layout and identified potential security vulnerabilities. All of this information was recorded using hidden cameras and encrypted communication equipment concealed inside the ship's regular electronics. When the ship returned to Copenhagen, the intelligence was extracted and sent back to Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. The first mission was a success. Iran saw a normal shipping company making a normal delivery. Mossad saw an intelligence goldmine. Over the next few months, Maritime Solutions made more shipments to Iranian ports. Each time, they gathered more intelligence. They started to understand Iran's maritime security. They identified patterns in port operations. They built relationships with Iranian port officials and business contacts. And that's when Mossad started to get ambitious. One of the embedded officers, let's call him David, which obviously isn't his real name, began cultivating a relationship with an Iranian port supervisor in Bandar Abbas. This supervisor was responsible for inspecting incoming cargo and coordinating with customs officials. David presented himself as a Danish shipping company employee who made regular trips to Iran. He was friendly. He brought small gifts from Europe. Nothing expensive or suspicious, just coffee, chocolates, cigarettes. He asked the supervisor about his family. He showed interest in Iranian culture. He built trust slowly over multiple visits. After about 6 months, David had a good relationship with this supervisor. They'd have tea together when the ship was in port. They'd talk about their families, their work, their lives. Then David started offering money. Not as a bribe exactly, but as a thank you for making the inspection process smooth and efficient, just a few $100s here and there. The supervisor initially refused, but eventually accepted. It started small, but grew over time. Now Mossad had someone inside the Iranian port who was compromised. Not a full agent. The supervisor didn't know he was helping Israeli intelligence, but he was accepting money from a foreign company, which made him vulnerable. If Savama found out, he'd be arrested for corruption. Once the supervisor was compromised, David slowly started asking for small favors. Could you expedite this inspection? Could you make sure this particular cargo container isn't opened? Nothing that seemed too suspicious, just normal requests that a shipping company might make to speed up their operations. The supervisor agreed. He was already taking money, so these small requests seemed reasonable. And that's how Mossad started smuggling things into Iran. The cargo containers that the supervisor was told not to inspect contained more than just regular goods. They had hidden compartments with surveillance equipment, communications gear, cameras, sometimes even weapons that would be delivered to Iranian opposition groups. The Iranian customs inspectors would check the containers, but because the supervisor had already pre-cleared them, the inspections were quick and superficial. Nobody looked too carefully. Nobody found the hidden compartments. This went on for months. Each shipment brought in more equipment. Mossad was building the infrastructure they needed for intelligence operations inside Iran. But equipment was only part of the plan. The really valuable thing was human intelligence, and Maritime Solutions provided the perfect cover for inserting agents into Iran. Here's how it worked. Maritime Solutions would hire a new crew member, someone who was actually a Mossad officer or an asset recruited from Iranian exile communities. This person would have complete documentation showing they were a European citizen with a background in maritime work. They'd join one of the ships on its route to Iran. When the ship docked in an Iranian port, this agent would go ashore. Maybe they'd say they needed to visit a local supplier. Maybe they'd claim they wanted to see the city during their time in port. Iranian authorities didn't closely monitor foreign sailors who were just visiting for a day or two. Once ashore, the agent would make contact with pre-arranged sources. These were Iranian citizens who'd been recruited by Mossad, either before the revolution when Israel still had access, or through intermediaries in other countries. The agent would meet them, receive intelligence reports, deliver instructions, and provide any equipment or money they needed. Then the agent would return to the ship, and when it left port, they'd go with it, in and out of Iran, without raising any suspicion. This was incredibly valuable. Mossad now had a regular, repeatable method of communicating with sources inside Iran. They didn't have to rely on risky methods like secret radio transmissions or messages hidden in dead drops. They could send officers directly into the country using commercial shipping as cover. And the beauty of it was that it looked completely normal. Ships came and went. Crew members sometimes went ashore. Nobody thought twice about it. By 1985, Maritime Solutions was making regular trips to 3 different Iranian ports. They'd expanded their business to include shipments to other Persian Gulf countries, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, which gave them additional cover and made them look even more legitimate. The company now employed over 40 people across offices in Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and Hamburg. Most still had no idea they were working for Mossad. The operation had become a well-oiled machine generating both intelligence and profit. But Mossad wanted more. They didn't just want to observe Iranian ports. They wanted to gather intelligence on Iran's military and industrial capabilities. And that required accessing facilities that weren't near the coast. So they came up with an even more ambitious plan. They'd use Maritime Solutions to establish business relationships with Iranian companies, real business partnerships that would give them access to facilities deep inside Iran. Here's how they did it. Maritime Solutions started offering logistics services beyond just shipping. They'd help Iranian companies coordinate entire supply chains, finding suppliers in Europe, arranging transport, handling customs, providing warehousing. This was valuable to Iranian businesses that were struggling under international sanctions and didn't have easy access to Western goods. Several Iranian companies signed contracts with Maritime Solutions for these services, and as part of these contracts, Maritime Solutions representatives would visit Iranian facilities to assess their needs and coordinate deliveries. These representatives were Mossad officers. They'd fly into Tehran on legitimate business visas. They'd visit factories, industrial sites, and research facilities. They'd take tours. They'd ask questions about production capacity, technical capabilities, and future needs. And the whole time, they were gathering intelligence. They'd photograph equipment. They'd assess technological capabilities. They'd identify what materials Iran was importing that might be used for weapons development. They'd note security procedures and facility layouts. All of this information went back to Israeli intelligence analysts who were trying to understand Iran's military and nuclear programs. One particularly successful operation involved a chemical plant near Tehran. Maritime Solutions had secured a contract to supply industrial chemicals to this facility. As part of the contract, they sent a technical advisor to assess the plant's needs and ensure the chemicals they supplied would be compatible with the plant's processes. This technical advisor was actually a Mossad officer with expertise in chemical engineering. He spent 3 days at the facility. He was given a complete tour. He saw the equipment they used, the processes they employed, and the products they manufactured. What he discovered was alarming. The facility was producing chemicals that had dual-use applications. They could be used for legitimate industrial purposes, but they could also be used to manufacture chemical weapons. The intelligence he gathered helped Israeli and American analysts understand Iran's chemical weapons program. It contributed to diplomatic pressure and sanctions that eventually forced Iran to sign the Chemical Weapons Convention, all because a Mossad officer posed as a shipping company employee. By 1988, Maritime Solutions had been operating for 8 years. It had become one of the most successful intelligence operations Mossad had ever run. They'd gathered deep detailed intelligence on Iranian ports, military facilities, and industrial capabilities. They'd built networks of sources inside Iran. They'd smuggled in equipment and weapons. They'd helped coordinate opposition groups. And all of this was happening while Iran had no idea they were being penetrated by Israeli intelligence. But there was a problem. The operation had grown so large and so complex that it was becoming harder to maintain security. Remember, most of the company's employees still didn't know they worked for Mossad. They thought they were just regular shipping company workers, but some of them were starting to notice odd things. Why? Did certain cargo containers never get properly inspected? Why did some crew members join the ships for just 1 or 2 voyages and then disappear? Why did the company sometimes take contracts that didn't seem profitable? Why were some of the senior executives so secretive about certain aspects of the business? A few employees started asking questions, not in a suspicious way, just normal curiosity. But questions are dangerous in intelligence operations. Mossad had to be very careful. They couldn't just fire people who asked questions. That would draw even more attention. So they'd reassure them with plausible explanations. Those crew members left for better opportunities. Those containers got expedited processing because we paid extra. Those unprofitable contracts were strategic investments in new markets. Most employees accepted these explanations, but a few remained curious. Then in 1990, something happened that nearly exposed everything. One of the ships, the one that made regular runs to Iranian ports, had a crew member who wasn't Mossad. He was a legitimate Dutch sailor who'd been working for Maritime Solutions for 3 years. Good employee, professional, no problems. But this sailor started dating a woman in Amsterdam who happened to work for a Dutch newspaper. And because people talked to their romantic partners, he mentioned some of the odd things he'd noticed about his employer. Cargo containers that weren't supposed to be opened. Crew members who seemed to have military training. Communication equipment that seemed more sophisticated than a normal cargo ship would need. Trips where they'd stay in Iranian ports longer than necessary without any clear business reason. His girlfriend was a journalist. She started to get curious. She began asking him more questions. Not because she suspected espionage, just because it sounded like an interesting story. Maybe the company was smuggling contraband. Maybe they were involved in sanctions violations. Either way, it could be a news story. She started researching Maritime Solutions. She looked at public records. She tried to find information about the company's ownership structure. She noticed that the trail of ownership went through several shell companies in different countries, which was unusual. Mossad's internal security noticed that someone was digging into Maritime Solutions. They monitored email communications and saw the journalist researching the company. They realized they had a problem. If a journalist published a story questioning Maritime Solutions' legitimacy, Iranian intelligence would definitely investigate. Even if the story didn't reveal that the company was a Mossad operation, it would make the Iranians suspicious. They'd look closer at the company's activities. They'd scrutinize cargo more carefully. They'd monitor crew members more closely. The operation would become too risky to continue. Mossad had 2 options. They could try to stop the journalist, intimidate her, bribe her, or feed her false information to kill her curiosity. Or they could shut down the operation before the story came out. Shutting down was the safer choice. Operations have a lifespan. Maritime Solutions had been running for 11 years, which was already longer than most front operations lasted. The intelligence they'd gathered had been incredibly valuable. But all operations eventually get exposed. The smart move was to end it on their terms before something forced their hand. So in late 1990, Mossad decided to wind down Maritime Solutions, but they couldn't just close the company overnight. That would look suspicious and might still trigger an investigation. They needed to shut it down in a way that looked natural, so they engineered a financial crisis for the company. They had Maritime Solutions take on several unprofitable contracts. They created accounting problems that made the company look financially unstable. They started missing payments to suppliers. Over about 6 months, they made it look like Maritime Solutions was going bankrupt. Creditors started demanding payment. The company started selling off assets to cover debts. They let go of employees. They sold their ships. They closed their offices. By mid-1991, Maritime Solutions was defunct. It had gone out of business like thousands of companies do every year. Completely normal. Nothing suspicious. The employees who lost their jobs thought they just worked for a company that failed. They moved on to other shipping companies. Most never knew they'd been working for Israeli intelligence. The Iranian businesses that had contracts with Maritime Solutions were disappointed to lose a reliable supplier, but they just found other shipping companies to work with. Iranian intelligence probably did investigate why one of their foreign partners had gone bankrupt, but they found exactly what Mossad wanted them to find: a company that had overextended itself financially and collapsed. Nothing about espionage. The operation was over, and it had been a massive success. Over 11 years, Maritime Solutions had gathered detailed intelligence on Iranian port facilities, naval capabilities, and industrial infrastructure. They'd inserted dozens of agents into Iran who'd built networks of sources. They'd smuggled in equipment that supported Iranian opposition groups. They'd established business relationships that gave them access to sensitive facilities. The intelligence gathered through this operation contributed to numerous Israeli military and diplomatic decisions regarding Iran. It helped Israel understand Iran's support for Hezbollah and other terrorist groups. It provided early warnings about Iran's missile development programs. It gave insights into Iran's nuclear ambitions years before they became public knowledge, and the total cost of the operation was relatively low because the company actually made money. Israeli taxpayers weren't funding an expensive intelligence operation. Iranian businesses were paying for their own surveillance. In intelligence terms, this was about as successful as an operation could be. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about operations like this. The setup was incredibly complex and risky. If Iran had discovered the truth at any point, they could have arrested and executed the Mossad officers operating as crew members. They could have seized the ships. They could have used it as propaganda to isolate Israel internationally. The people who ran this operation were operating in constant danger. Every trip to an Iranian port could have been the one where something went wrong. Every meeting with a compromised port official could have been a trap. Every business meeting at an Iranian facility could have ended in arrest, but they did it anyway, for 11 years. Because that's what intelligence work requires: taking calculated risks, operating in hostile territory, maintaining cover for years at a time. And this wasn't the only operation of its kind. Mossad and other intelligence agencies have created dozens of front companies over the years. Some have been exposed, but many probably haven't. There are likely companies operating right now, businesses that look completely legitimate, that are actually intelligence fronts. They could be consulting firms, tech companies, import-export businesses, travel agencies. They employ real people who have no idea they're working for an intelligence agency. They make real money while gathering intelligence. The Maritime Solutions operation showed how effective this approach could be, and intelligence agencies around the world studied it and copied the methods. The CIA created front companies to operate in hostile countries. Russian intelligence did the same. Chinese intelligence. Every major intelligence agency realized that commercial cover was one of the most effective ways to gather information. And the scary part is how hard these operations are to detect. If the cover company is truly operating as a real business, if it's making money and serving real clients, if most of its employees are legitimate, how do you tell the difference between that and an actual company? You probably can't unless you have inside information or someone makes a mistake. That's what happened with Maritime Solutions. Not a mistake by Mossad. They ran the operation professionally, but a random coincidence that a crew member started dating a journalist who got curious. Without that, the operation might have continued for years longer, or it might have been shut down for other reasons we don't know about. Because here's the thing, most of what I've told you comes from information that leaked out after the operation ended. Books written by former intelligence officers, declassified documents, investigative reporting, but huge parts of this story are still classified. We don't know the company's real name. We don't know all the details of what intelligence was gathered. We don't know how many agents were inserted into Iran. We don't know what happened to the Iranian sources who provided information. And we definitely don't know about other operations like this that are still running. That's the nature of intelligence work. You learn about the successes from 20 or 30 years ago, but you don't know what's happening right now. You don't know which companies are fronts. You don't know which business people are actually intelligence officers. The world of international business and the world of espionage overlap way more than most people realize. And operations like Maritime Solutions show just how blurred that line can be. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't a story about ships or cargo or business deals. This was a story about one country's desperate need to understand an enemy that wanted to destroy them, about the creative and risky methods intelligence agencies use to gather information in hostile environments, about the ordinary people who unknowingly became part of espionage operations, and about the careful planning required to maintain a cover story for over a decade. Mossad turned turned a shipping company into a spy network. They convinced Iran to let them into their ports regularly. They built business relationships that gave them access to sensitive facilities. They operated right under the nose of Iranian intelligence for 11 years. And when it was over, they walked away clean. No captured agents, no international incident, no exposure of methods that would compromise future operations. Just a company that went bankrupt and disappeared. Nothing to see here. Move along. Except that company gathered intelligence that shaped Israeli security policy for decades. Information that contributed to understanding Iran's weapons programs. Networks that continued to operate even after the company shut down. That's the real legacy of Maritime Solutions. Not just the intelligence gathered during those 11 years, but the proof that creative cover operations could penetrate even the most hostile environments. That commercial businesses could serve as perfect cover for espionage. That patience and careful planning could achieve what aggressive, risky operations might never accomplish. Intelligence agencies learned from this. They refined the techniques. They created new front companies using the same principles. And somewhere right now, there's probably a company that looks completely normal, that's doing real business, that's making real money, but that exists primarily to gather intelligence for some government. You might even know someone who works for one of these companies. They probably have no idea. They think they're just doing a normal job at a normal company. That's how good these operations can be when they're done right. Maritime Solutions wasn't just a successful intelligence operation. It was a masterclass in how to create and maintain deep cover in hostile territory, how to blend espionage with legitimate business, how to gather critical intelligence while appearing completely innocent. And the craziest part, this was all done before the internet era, before modern surveillance technology, before artificial intelligence and data analytics. They did this with basic technology, careful planning, and human intelligence. Imagine what's possible now with modern technology. The operations running today are probably way more sophisticated than anything from the 1980s and 90s. That's both impressive and terrifying. Impressive because it shows human creativity and intelligence at its peak. Terrifying because it means the world of espionage is even more hidden and complex than we can imagine. So the next time you see a business operating in a dangerous part of the world, or a company with an unusually diverse international presence, or a firm that seems a bit too professional and well-funded for its size, maybe wonder if there's more to the story. Because if Maritime Solutions taught us anything, it's that things aren't always what they seem, and the most successful intelligence operations are the ones nobody suspects. Subscribe to learn more intelligence operations.